My name is Elias, and for a long time, I believed that the story of my life was already written in the stars, right next to hers. Her name was Clara. We were told that love conquers all, but they never mentioned that love is powerless against the microscopic code of human blood. We had survived a decade of growth, distance, and the changing seasons of our lives, only to be defeated by a laboratory report printed on standard A4 paper. This is the story of how 10 years of forever ended in a sterile clinic hallway, not because we stopped loving each other, but because our bodies were a lethal match. Join me as I tell you how I lost the love of my life. It started in the humidity of a high school chemistry lab, ironically enough. Clara was my lab partner, more interested in making me laugh than titration. I remember the way she'd whisper jokes under her breath while the teacher droned on about molecular bonds, unaware that we were forming a bond far more volatile. Our first kiss happened behind the bleachers after a rainy football game, the air smelling of wet grass and teenage desperation. We were 17, and the world was small enough to fit inside the palm of our joined hands. We made a pact then, a naive, beautiful promise, that no matter where life took us, we would be the exception to the rule. University was a sprawling, chaotic test of that promise. Clara went to the northern tip of the country for engineering, and I stayed south for communications. We became masters of the midnight bus and the flickering light of video calls. I remember one February when a blizzard hit her campus. Clara spent her last savings on a train ticket just to stand outside my dorm for an hour because I'd mentioned feeling lonely. We spent that night sharing a single narrow bed, listening to the wind howl, convinced that if we could survive 4 years of being 300 miles apart, we were invincible. We grew into adults together, shedding our teenage skins but keeping the same core. We saw each other through the deaths of grandparents, the stress of final dissertations, and the terrifying uncertainty of our first job interviews. By our mid-20s, we were the golden couple of our social circle. I had climbed into a high-pressure role as a creative director, and Clara was a lead consultant at a top tech firm. Our lives were a sophisticated blur of gallery openings and corporate retreats, but our favorite moments were still the quiet ones. I remember a rainy Tuesday in our first shared apartment when the power went out. Instead of complaining, we lit every candle we owned and danced in the kitchen to no music at all, tripping over boxes we hadn't unpacked yet. "I'll still be doing this with you when we're 80, Elias," Clara whispered into my hair. And I believed her. I would have bet my life on it. The engagement was a masterpiece of planning. I took Clara back to that old high school library, having bribed the janitor to let us in after hours. I knelt by the same desk where we'd carved our names a decade earlier. The ring was perfect, but the look in her eyes was better, a mixture of terrifying vulnerability and absolute certainty. The months that followed were a fever dream of white lace, cake tastings, and guest lists that spanned generations. We were so close to the finish line. The medical screening was supposed to be a footnote. We walked into the diagnostic center holding hands, joking about who was more afraid of the blood draw. We were healthy, athletic, and vibrant. We felt untouchable. But when the doctor called us back into his office 3 days later, the air in the room felt heavy, like it had been replaced with lead. He didn't look us in the eye. He spoke about hemoglobin genotypes, about AS, and the 1 in 4 chance of a child inheriting a lifetime of pain. The 1 in 4 sounded like a gamble to the doctor, but to Clara and me, it sounded like a death sentence. We sat in the car in the parking lot for 4 hours, the engine off, the silence ringing in our ears. I watched a young mother across the street pushing a stroller, and for the first time in my life, I felt a physical ache of fear. We tried to bargain. We spent nights scouring the internet for medical breakthroughs, for ways to fix what was written in our marrow. We talked about IVF with genetic screening, but the costs were astronomical and the success rates weren't promises. The heartbreak didn't happen in one sharp snap. It was a slow, agonizing erosion. We began to look at each other and see the shadow of a suffering child instead of a partner. Our touches became heavy with the weight of what we couldn't have. One night, after a dinner where neither of us ate, Clara looked at me with tears streaming down her face and said, "If we do this, Elias, and our child suffers because of our selfishness, I will never be able to look at you without seeing their pain. And I love you too much to hate you." Breaking the news to our families was like dropping a bomb on a celebration already in progress. My mother collapsed into a chair, her hand over her mouth, while my father stared at the genotype results as if he could rearrange the letters with his sheer will. "But you and Clara have been together forever," my mother whispered. "Can't modern medicine do something?" Clara's parents were even more devastated. They had already started calling me their son. We sat in her family's living room, surrounded by half-wrapped wedding favors, and watched the light go out of their eyes. There was no anger, no scandal, no other person to blame, just a biological technicality that felt like a betrayal from God. Our siblings tried to offer platitudes, but how do you comfort two people who are being forced to choose between their love for each other and the safety of their unborn children? Healing didn't come in a straight line. For months after Clara and I separated, I was a ghost in my own life. I moved into a small, sterile bachelor apartment where the silence was so loud it made my ears ring. I threw myself into my work at the agency, staying until 10 p.m. every night just so I wouldn't have to go home to an empty bed. I went to therapy, where I sat for hours trying to explain that I wasn't grieving a breakup, I was grieving a death. The death of a future that had been as real to me as the ground beneath my feet. I learned to breathe again, slowly. I learned that I could go a whole hour without checking Clara's social media, then a whole day, then a week. I learned that the love wasn't gone, it had just changed shape. It was no longer a fire that kept me warm, it was a scar that reminded me I had once lived fully. It's been 5 years now. I recently saw a photo of Clara through a mutual friend. She was holding a baby, not hers, but a niece, and she looked happy. Her eyes still had that spark I fell in love with behind the chemistry lab. I am okay now, too. I've started dating again, carefully, with my medical records almost always in my back pocket. I've realized that our 10 years weren't a waste of time just because they didn't end in a marriage certificate. They were the years that made me the man I am. Elias and Clara are the survivors of a love that was too beautiful for this world's harsh realities. I still love her, in a way that belongs to the past, and I think I always will. Thank you for listening to my story. Have you ever had to make a difficult sacrifice for the sake of the future? Share your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of love, loss, and life. Your support means the world.